Hello and welcome to my channel. So everyone knows that King Edward II was murdered after he had been usurped from the throne by his wife Isabella of France and her lover Roger Mortimer. But what if Edward wasn't murdered? What if he had managed to escape from Berkeley Castle? So before we get into whether or not Edward did survive and managed to escape, we just have to go through all the history of how we got to the point where he was being kept in Berkeley Castle and possibly being murdered. So King Edward II was the youngest child and the only surviving son of King Edward I of England and his wife Eleanor. So it is the general consensus now that King Edward II was gay, or even that he was possibly bi, because he did have children with his wife, and it also was rumoured that he had fathered an illegitimate son. But whether he was gay or bi, he definitely had male favourites. But the problem with this was that he would give his favourites whatever they wanted, and his favourites knew how to get whatever they wanted from him. So Edward's first favourite was Piers Gaveston. When Edward went to France to marry his wife Isabella, he left Piers in charge of the country. This was unusual for the time, like leaving sole charge to one person without a council of people to help them, and this also gave Piers unprecedented powers. And of course the barons of the land were not happy with this. So when Edward returned back to England from France with his new wife, he ran straight into the arms of Piers. He then gave Piers a key role in his and Isabella's coronation, and then at the feast afterwards, Piers sat at the top table next to Edward in the place where Isabella should have been. And this angered both the English and the French. To keep the peace, Edward was forced to send Piers into exile in 1308, but in 1309 Piers was allowed to return to England. Edward did manage to come to an agreement with the nobles, saying that he would limit the power that Piers had as a royal steward. But things were still uneasy. Piers was considered arrogant by the barons and took to calling the earls offensive names. Edward was petitioned to sack Piers as his counsellor and instead take the advice of 21 elected barons. Edward had no choice but to accept this, so the elected barons drew up their reforms. These reforms limited the king's right to go to war and to grant land without Parliament's consent. It also exiled Piers again. So tensions were high and the earls kept their private armies mobilised. Edward recalled Piers from exile and they and Isabella went on the run. They were pursued by the Earl of Lancaster, who was King Edward's cousin, who ended up capturing Piers in Scarborough, and then he was given into the care of the Earl of Pembroke. In the village of Dedington, the Earl of Warwick, who Piers had insulted by calling the dog of Warwick, took Piers and after a brief trial declared him to be guilty of being a traitor and had him executed. Edward was of course furious at this and civil war did seem likely, but negotiations managed to stop that from happening. So after Piers' death, Edward did pay more attention to his wife Isabella and they had some children. But he soon had a new favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Hugh was Edward's chamberlain and he had married into the De Clare family, who were really wealthy. So Hugh had acquired Glamorgan in the Welsh marshes and had expanded his power and holdings across Wales at the expense of the other Marcher lords, which obviously annoyed them. So Edward's cousin, the Earl of Lancaster, and the Despensers were bitter enemies, so he ended up siding with the Marcher lords, and then civil war broke out. Edward and Hugh the Younger, who Edward, according to one chronicler, loved dearly with all his heart, heard about the Lord's coalition and hoped that they could sort everything out with mediation. But they couldn't sort it out. The Despenser lands were seized and Edward had no choice but to exile the Despensers. But then Edward extracted his revenge on all the barons and lords that had gone against him. The Despensers were brought back from exile, and then Edward had his cousin, the Earl of Lancaster, executed. He then punished his cousin's supporters by either executing them or seizing their land and giving it to the Despensers. Hugh the Younger now lived a grand life, becoming very wealthy, some say through fraud, but things were not quite settled. In 1324, war had broken out with France over Edward's territory of Gascony. In 1325, Edward sent Isabella over to France to negotiate with the French king, who was now her brother. So Isabella did manage to negotiate a settlement, but Edward had to send his eldest son, also called Edward, over to France to pay homage to the French king for the territory of Gascony. Now, Isabella and young Edward were meant to return to England after this happened, but they didn't, and that was because Isabella had a plan. So by this point, Isabella really disliked her husband and his favourite. She was embarrassed that she had to escape 3 times from the Scottish armies and blamed Hugh for the last time that this had happened. She didn't like the fact that a truce that Edward had agreed with the Scottish king Robert the Bruce severely disadvantaged her close friends the Beaumonts. She hated the way Hugh Despenser the Younger abused high-status women. She was angry that in 1324 her household had been arrested and her lands seized. But the final straw came when Edward had taken away her children and given them to the custody of Hugh's wife. So in France, Isabella had met Roger Mortimer. He was a martial lord who was in exile. And together they hatched a plan to invade England, dispose of Edward II and place young Edward on the throne. So when they invaded England, they were met with no resistance, and the Despensers' enemies flocked to join them. Edward and Hugh fled, but they were captured near Caerphilly. Hugh the Younger was put on trial and found guilty of being a traitor, so he was executed by being disemboweled, castrated and then quartered. Edward was forced to abdicate in favour of his son and was put in prison in Berkeley Castle. But Edward II being alive posed an issue. There were concerns about plots to liberate him and then put him back on the throne. So Edward had to go. On the 21st of September 1327, Edward II was murdered by having a red hot poker shoved up his rectum. But what if Edward hadn't been murdered? What if he had escaped prison and lived the rest of his life in exile in Europe? In 1878, a letter was discovered in Montpellier which said exactly this. The letter was addressed to King Edward III and had been written by a Genoese priest called Manuele Fineschi and had been written around 1337. The letter says that on finding out that he was about to be murdered, Edward II had swapped clothes with a servant and had escaped Berkeley Castle by killing the gatekeeper. The body that had been buried as Edward was that of a porter at Berkeley Castle who had been killed by the assassins so that they wouldn't get into trouble. After his escape, Edward had gone to Courthy Castle in Dorset and stayed there for 18 months. He then went to Ireland for 9 months before travelling to the Low Counties and then on to Italy. In Italy, he had lived the rest of his life in Masonic hermitages in Cheshire. But is this letter and story real? So the letter is real. It is currently in the Archives Departementales de Haute at Montpellier. It has been tested and has been found to be from its time and not a later forgery. So Fieschi was actually a really well-known historical figure. He was a papal notary who later became a bishop. And he was a member of the Fieschi family, who were a noble merchant family from Genoa in Italy. So there are some people who believe the contents of this letter to be true because it contains details in it that not many people knew at the time. The historian Ian Mortimer said that it is almost certain that Edward did not die that night in 1327. And historian Alison Weir also believes that what is in that letter is true. Knowing that he had no support at home, and when his son came of age, Edward decided not to try and reclaim his throne, but instead lived the rest of his time out in Italy. In the town of Sesima, it is said that an English king was buried there, but his body was repatriated to England by his son. There is an empty medieval tomb in the town, which is said to be where the king's body was buried. So the funeral for the person who's supposed to be Edward could have been that for the gatekeeper. Local dignitaries were invited to look at the body, but they had to do so from a distance. And the body had also been embalmed, which may have made it unrecognisable. So normally the body would have been carried through the street on its way to the funeral, but for the first time a wooden effigy of King Edward II was carried instead. So there's also the story about the time King Edward III went to Koblenz in Germany to be installed as a vicar of the Holy Roman Empire. There Edward met a man called William the Welshman who claimed to be his father. But it is not known what happened to William. So people who don't believe the story says that the letter is of its time, but was written to Edward to blackmail him to try and undermine his position. So that's a little story about whether or not King Edward II was murdered in Berkeley Castle, or whether he escaped and lived out his life in Italy. What do you think happened? Do you reckon he died, or do you reckon he survived? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye!